Where did you find him? He adds an emotional context to the whole thing that I think is missing from most of these films, actually, on the American side at least, where people, I mean, in the Iraqi side, you see people get very emotional for obvious reasons. Bombs have been dropped on them. But in the case of an American, people quickly become detached. They start talking from their heads, not from their guts. And he doesn't do that. You know, he always reminds you where he's coming from. Even if he changes his mind, he reminds you.
No, well, Wilton was very skeptical of me when I first called. I remember he says now, he jokes that he thought I was going to make some Michael Moore kind of thing, and he would never have participated in that. And I think Wilton was skeptical of me at the start. So many people had weighed in about 9/11 in ways Wilton found very objectionable, and he had found the whole media treatment of 9/11. He talks about this in the film. He had found the whole treatment by the media so exploitative and really so heartless that I think he was very camera shy and very shy of submitting his son's memory to the whim of a media maker. At the same time, I think Wilton felt a very profound desire to memorialize Jason. And I think by getting closer to me and me getting closer to him and us gaining some understanding of each other, Wilton felt emboldened to take the chance that he took to allow me to handle, to some extent, the very delicate, extraordinarily sensitive matter of his son's memory. I'm forever indebted to Wilton for having taken a chance on me and on my film, and it does the film, I mean, it changes the film. The film would never have been the same film without it.
His opening expressions, he goes through a character arc and a change as we discover watching the film, but his initial reaction to 9/11 is so visceral. It resembles mine in a lot of ways. I'm from New York, and you can't. People who are not from New York and don't realize how personally you take that. You grew up there. You know, you can't, it's just not something that just happened. It's not even like the Pentagon. It's something it really is something that you can't think about without thoughts of vengeance or retribution. You know, you absolutely can't. And I would imagine. I wonder sometimes if anybody would imagine what would have happened if a president hadn't done anything. Hadn't invaded, done anything, just made speeches, you know, taken the United Nations approach, as some people think. What do you think would have happened in that case? How would Americans react, and how would that anger needed to be expressed in some way? That's the question, is how that happens. But he touches on that in such an astonishing way, and I'm really glad you had it in the film. But talk about that.
I have mixed feelings about that as a New Yorker myself and as someone who lost friends in the building, and I know a lot of people who've lost family. You know, there's no question Wilton represents the American reaction of anger to 9/11 and very much the concentrated reaction of vengeance that certain people felt after the attacks. But I can tell you that in a way, I remember walking around New York City in the days after that and finding that people were very much not seeking vengeance, that Americans of all stripes in New York City, and I saw beyond as well in places where we were traveling at that time, that people were looking inward a lot. They were asking tougher questions about why this had happened, why anyone could hate the United States so much as to fly planes into our buildings and kill our civilians. That very deep looking reaction was mirrored by the grief of the rest of the world for the United States. There was a moment, I believe, and I think Joe Cirincione says this in our film, where the eyes of the world were on the United States, and their prayers were with us, and we ourselves were looking inward for a moment. And I think in Washington there was a spirit of vengeance that said, here is a moment, as we now know, a moment that was seen as useful by those making policy decisions. I hate to say that, but that is clear from the texted documentation of the meetings, that the moment of 9/11, tragic as it may have been, proved useful to certain policymakers who exploited it to drum up a kind of drumbeat for war. I, for one, do not believe that the natural reaction to the attacks of 9/11 should have been to bomb the country of Afghanistan, a country of people who have gone through decades of war, who are impoverished, and who were already besieged by a group of people, the Taliban, with whom the United States had been allied for a very long time. So it seemed an inappropriate choice by the United States to suddenly declare itself, it's like Bonnie deciding they're Clyde's policemen. The reality is we were in a partnership with the Taliban for a very long time, and it gave us a kind of, for me, a doubtful moral authority to go do that. Having said that, of course, the larger question is, since so many of the hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, and since we all know too well that at the highest levels of this country there are very close relations between ourselves and the Saudi royal family, the unfortunate question, of course, is why was the country of origin thought to be Afghanistan, since the bulk of those involved were from Saudi Arabia? That's the troubling question. But I think Wilton represents that desire for revenge, rightly or wrongly, and I can never tell somebody in Wilton's shoes that anything is wrong. He is entitled to his anger. He's entitled to his desire for revenge. But I think what Wilton himself learns, and I hope audiences see it through his experience, is the danger of revenge. That, of course, the old adage that violence begets violence, that an eye for an eye and the whole world is blind. We hear all these phrases, but I don't think they come to mean as much as when someone like Wilton sees how his own desire for revenge is so exploited by the powerful and so used to launch yet another set of innocent lives into the sort of tragic memory of a lost one.
Spielberg's Munich, which of course deals with a fictionalized version of a parallel dilemma, the 1972 murder of the Israeli athletes. You have interviews with Richard Pearl and Bill Kristol, and in some respects they are kind of the neoconservatives. And I've read in other contexts, whether I don't know if I'm sure of your publicity materials or not, that they represent a pro-Israel point of view too. Some of the people behind this policy certainly do. So there's a direct parallel between what Israel sought to do after Munich, in some respects what some people around the White House may have sought to do, after 9/11, and the whole notion of Israel's relationship to the United States foreign policy, up and pro and con. It's controversial, but let's talk a little bit about that.
Fled Nazi Germany in 1939. My mother's family fled Tsarist Russia in the early 20th century. And so I am a child of flight. I'm a child of the experience of persecution and of totalitarianism and other forms of abuse. And so I look very closely, as many people in that situation do, at the way the world evolves and when the writing is on the wall of those kind of experiences. And I am, as a Jewish American, very troubled by the conduct of Israel in the matters between Israel and Palestine, as much as I'm troubled by a Palestinian terror group who decides to use human life as a political tool. I think in either side of that conflict, it has so degraded that each side now understands that terror is seems to be their only road for policy negotiation. Of course, that is a sort of a tragic and misguided long-term outlook. And I think Steven Spielberg's film, and I hope my film, both look at the senselessness of vengeance and the senselessness of the spiral of violence. Why We Fight is ultimately about the sort of never-ending cycle of wars in which we seem to find ourselves. This concept comes up in the film called Blowback, and Blowback is about the unintended consequences of foreign operations. It's a CIA term, and it really is what the CIA uses to talk about the kind of collateral damage that'll happen when they overthrow a regime or invade a country or secretly corrupt a democratic process, that very often there are friends we have to make who come back to haunt us, like Saddam Hussein, like the Taliban, like Osama bin Laden, and very often also we arm certain groups that then turn out to be troublesome within their own countries and troublesome to the world order. And that's just one part in my film of how the senselessness of this kind of violent engineering manifests itself. And I think in Steven Spielberg's film, it's really the matter of this sort of, when does the violence end? At what point is enough enough, and you cannot solve your problems violently? I hope both films are seen that way, and the Jewish experience in that is, of course, very, very poignant, because who more than the Jewish people emerging from the Holocaust could carry the international dreams for human rights than the Jewish people? And I think one of the tragedies of the involvement of Jewish figures in the neoconservative movement in this country, for example, is that in many ways I think they are forgetting the lessons of the past. They are allying themselves with a kind of hawkish doctrine of U.S. foreign policy, that puts military solutions at the forefront of our thinking. And I think, sure, it is clear that a military solution was needed to stop Adolf Hitler, without which, with the world, God knows where we would be. And so one could take one's lessons from that. I think many of the neoconservatives do. They often point to the totalitarian regimes that needed to be stopped with military force. But I think they also need to understand that history is the long story of the fact that cycles of violence are never broken until we find ways of resolving conflict through more viable long-term means. I point to the revolution in South Africa, run by Nelson Mandela, with a level of wisdom about violence that caused a nearly bloodless revolution in the end after so many years of bloody apartheid. And we've seen that in so many chapters, and yet it's easily ignored by certain policymakers who may see, as you mentioned, a convenient overlap of interest between the short-term interests of Israel and the short-term interests of the United States. But I say short-term because I think it's in the long-term interest of neither.
How did you find the coroner in Iraq, the guy who opens up the morgue? And who are victims of what are we seeing in that particular context?
We were keenly aware that our film was happening at a time of war and needed to capture the war firsthand, and we weren't confident we would be getting true-to-life, up-close images through the embedding process that so much of the media had signed on to. And so a very courageous young journalist named May-Ying Welsh is a war correspondent whose work can actually be seen in the film Bearing Witness, the Barbara Koppel film, which is largely about May-Ying. She's actually the daughter of Lonnie Ding, the great Asian-American filmmaker. And I think in that, May-Ying was able to go abroad. She speaks the local language and really meet individual people and learn very, very intimate thoughts that they had about America at this time of war, the country that was attacking their country, the reasons. The answers they give are very textured, not just classic, good Iraq, good Saddam, bad America. They're often very, very much more textured than that, far more textured than many of the people we met on the street in America, I hate to say. But in getting those interviews, we were finding our way to the moments of the initial strike in the war, because that's part of what the film tells the story of. As you know, the two pilots who launched the opening strike on Iraq are featured in the film. They are two elite stealth fighter pilots who were given the task of assassinating Saddam Hussein in the opening hours of the conflict. And the bodies you see are bodies that are essentially it's hard to identify, because basically the bodies, once they get to the morgue level, have already gone through the hospitalization level, and their particular origin is not known the same way it is at the hospital level. So the scenes you see in the film of the hospital, those are doctors we went to shortly after the strike who were able to recount for us in much more vivid detail. These wounded came in from that region, the Dora Farms area, where those first bombs fell on that particular night. They could give us much more an account of that. By the time they get to the morgue was such a scene of incredible carnage and chaos that the morgue director himself said it'd be very hard for me to know who came in when, but I can show, and from where, but I can show you in my books the record of who came in when. And when you see him in the film walking through, here was a civilian, here was a child, here was a student, here was a female worker, here was a bus driver, what he's doing there is walking through that they weren't military targets. These were not soldiers being brought in by and large. It was civilians, and that was really the lesson of that. I don't show in the film because I tend not to exploit moments like that, but the morgue director, who you would think sees bloodshed every day, buries people every day, catalogs them, breaks into tears in the middle of the interview and simply can't go on reading from his book. It's just once he sees it on paper and starts to realize how widespread it is, that it just keeps being civilians. It's almost a truth he knew but hadn't had to go through the exercise of exploring. But that's we got to talk to him, and it was a great privilege. And he's since been quoted a lot. I mean, we'd see him appear now and then in the New York Times, which is and elsewhere, which is really more a case study that the body count simply keeps rising, unfortunately.
Clinton did something that was, I think, parallel to what's happening in Iraq and Yugoslavia, but quite different. The intervention in Yugoslavia, which many people on the left urged as an anti-genocidal situation. And when U.S. power was used in a region we didn't have any specific interest in to combat a more classic case of genocide. And I think that should be brought in, that the notion of what U.S. power can do, and someone like Clinton should be given some credit for that, because we find at times that there's no legitimate use for U.S. power. That's the way the debate comes out, or there's the crystal side and there's the other side, and there's no thing in between. I think the Clinton example, where there's very little loss of American life and less loss of Yugoslavian life than there might have otherwise been.
Need for humanitarian intervention is a complicated one about which there can be a tremendous amount of debate, and it's a vital debate for our times because we live in complicated times. The United States does occupy a position of enormous power in the world with the capacity to try to intervene when necessary to do so.
10 years after Dayton, we've apparently done that.
Yes, but I think the problem comes down ultimately to the need for international institutions. What you saw in Clinton's case, however flawed the United Nations may appear to be, every organization is flawed. Absolutely, and every organization is flawed. I'm not apologizing for the United Nations, but I want it known that there has also been, by this administration, an extraordinary campaign of negative PR launched against the United Nations in order to impeach the United Nations' desire to slow the rush to the Iraq War. That's fine, but I think but one has to look at this issue holistically. The benefit that one can speak of with Bill Clinton is, however flawed the United Nations was in the conduct of that, Bill Clinton understood the importance of working in concert with other nations. This administration hijacked that idea. They pretended they had a coalition of other countries. They did not. But I think it's very dangerous to say sort of good Clinton, bad Bush. The patterns in my film that I look at, I really believe are fundamental to life in America. They're not about Bush. They're not about one administration or one party, because what they are about is what are the forces that are corrupting our foreign policy apparatus, so that it's hard for us to even breathe easy and trust that a decision like the decision about humanitarian intervention in the Balkans is being made appropriately. Because what we find out always after the fact is that behind closed doors there were cutthroat negotiations going on about geostrategic positioning and reserves and resources that we were trying to gain a better hold of. And we seem to choose these fights when it suits us for geostrategic position, including when we chose to enter that conflict, why we chose to enter it. And there's just too often a sort of a black cloud that hovers over these activities. And I think the more we can get out of this problem of a poisoned central decision-making apparatus, we can then look at the world and really start to make collective decisions with other nations in accord with some in sort of standardized norms of conduct in the world about when and how to intervene when the use of force is called for as a last resort. Because right now that's not what we do. What we end up doing is really tipping our hat to the rest of the world in some token way, but basically doing what an empire does, which is its own business, and nobody has anything to say about it. The United States is not going to be an empire forever. There are already the rise of new players, and so I would like to see us get used to getting along and being able to share our toys with the other children, because if we don't, it's going to happen to us anyway. So we're just going to end up being a kind of an outmoded bully who doesn't know how to get along with anyone, but actually doesn't have that much power anymore compared to the others. So it's a very dangerous thing, and you don't have to be an idealist to think so.
Kissinger, in a sense, symbolically as a war criminal on trial, and you were kind of Christopher Hitchens is on your side in that one, and not in this particular thing. Talk a little bit about that relationship, how people part company over situations that seem in some ways very similar.
And I think Christopher is a contrarian in the truest sense. And when he saw, I mean, this is my own conjecture, but I get the feeling that in the advance of the Iraq War, there were two forces influencing the way Christopher Hitchens, I think, saw the Iraq War. One of them was the experience of the Balkans. I think many journalists on the left came to sort of see the relevance of the U.S. military and U.S. military intervention through that conflict, through crying out for it and seeing its necessity. And so when the Iraq War came, it was almost like, well, what's good for the goose should be good for the gander. Here again, we're told of a dictator with plans and schemes that should be stopped by any self-respecting democracy. And I think so. Christopher was sort of manifesting the Balkan experience in his viewpoint on Iraq. I think also he was offended as a contrarian. I think he was offended by the tendency of the American left in an effort to villainize George Bush. Their tendency to heroize Saddam Hussein. Christopher knows too much about the experience of Iraqi people under Saddam Hussein, using our weapons, by the way, but let's forget about that. He knows too much about that to have allowed the American left to create this kind of simplicity routine. And I think one of the examples of this that I've heard is, if you look at Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11, there's only one shot of Saddam Hussein in that movie, and he's dancing a jig, and cheerfully. And I think to show that film with that shot in it to people in Iraq who have been victimized by Saddam Hussein is an insult, that part. I mean, I think very highly of other parts of the film, but I understand Christopher's reaction to that kind of thing. And so I think it drove him, Christopher, to another whole extreme, which was to support a war that I'm sure, though he may not admit it, he deeply regrets having supported.
But Eisenhower isn't mentioned very much, and he's not given much credit, and there's not a nuanced look at Eisenhower. I think this is probably the most nuanced look at Eisenhower I've ever seen on contemporary film. Probably exists in books. Talk a little bit about how you came to do that, because I think it's one of the fascinating sides of the film, using his farewell address.
Film The Trials of Henry Kissinger, that I encountered the farewell address of Dwight Eisenhower, and I was awestruck by the prescience in his warning, by the way in which he really saw so much unfold that has now unfolded in America around us, and he seemed to have known it long before it was happening. Eisenhower, I think, walks among us today as a figure of extraordinary depth of understanding, and we see the scandals in Washington, from the Abramoff scandal to the abuse of presidential power and the wiretapping, to this exorbitant budget for war. A Nobel economist yesterday saying that the war would cost more than $2 trillion. We're spending about $750 billion each year on the Defense Department, more than all other parts of the discretionary federal budget combined: health, education, transportation. It's a runaway militaristic garrison state. It's exactly what Eisenhower was afraid we would run into. And when I discovered that about him, I discovered that Eisenhower is, in fact, in those days, a man significantly to the left of today's Democrats, which really is a case study in how the country itself has slipped so far to the right. But I would say it doesn't matter right or left. What this country... Yes, in many ways. And he was pushed, Eisenhower, very hard by Kennedy to be more of a hawk, which he found hilarious until he found it downright infuriating. What very few people realize is that Eisenhower, they say, why did he make this military-industrial complex warning? Well, what I learned from Eisenhower's family members, John, his son who's in the film, and Susan, his granddaughter, is that during the 50s, there had been this campaign against Eisenhower to make it understood that he was weak on the Soviets, that he was kind of a dove on communism, and that the way they did that was to accuse him of having let a missile gap, as they called it, emerge between ourselves and the Soviet Union. That this particularly came out of the Kennedy camp as they approached the election against Richard Nixon. Eisenhower was made furious by this because he was very aware that there was no missile gap with the Soviet Union, except to the extent that we were far ahead of the Soviet Union in missile development. But you got to realize, the only way Eisenhower knew that was that he was flying secret U-2 spy missions over the Soviet Union, and that's how he knew, but he couldn't reveal that. So it was like a boxer sitting on his stool in the corner of the ring getting beaten up by the other fighter. He couldn't get up. He had to sit on his hands, and he couldn't reveal the only defense he would have had against a soldier like himself being accused of being soft on the Soviets. And so I think it led him to the kind of level of frustration that ultimately manifest itself in that military-industrial complex warning. His granddaughter in the film says Eisenhower at one point in frustration said aloud, "God help this country when somebody sits at this desk who doesn't know as much about the military as I